The gavel didn't merely strike the wood that day. It pierced a raw nerve that would reverberate throughout the entire nation. "Stand up, Sergeant," the judge ordered coldly. "I don't care if you left your legs behind in some desert you never should have been sent to. In my courtroom, you will show respect." Judge Harlan Beckett's voice sliced through the heavy silence like a blade of ice. But as Sergeant First Class Tyrone Caldwell struggled to rise, his prosthetic limb buckled, and a single worn dog tag slipped from his pocket. When the judge saw the name engraved on that metal, every trace of color drained from his face. The man he was about to destroy held the one secret capable of shattering the judge's entire life. This was no ordinary trial. It was a devastating collision between a hero's buried trauma and a villain's long-hidden sins. Stay with me, because what unfolded next left the entire gallery weeping and brought a powerful man to his knees, begging for mercy. The atmosphere in the courtroom was suffocating, thick with the scent of floor wax, old paper, and the bitter edge of impending ruin. Behind the high mahogany bench sat Judge Harlan Beckett, a man whose reputation for harsh rulings was matched only by his legendary lack of compassion. To him, the law was a cold machine, and he was its ruthless operator. People were not human beings, they were case files. Across from him, at the defense table, sat Tyrone Caldwell. At 45, Tyrone's face carried the deep lines of Kandahar's merciless sun and a jagged scar along his jaw from a roadside blast in Fallujah. He wore his dress blues, though they fit a little tighter now than they had years ago. On his chest gleamed a silver star and a purple heart, medals that usually commanded respect in any room. But Judge Beckett wasn't looking at the medals. He was checking his watch. "Mr. Caldwell," the judge droned, his voice nasal and impatient, "we are here for final sentencing on the incident of October 14th. You have pleaded guilty to misdemeanor assault. While the prosecution has recommended probation in light of your background, I remain unconvinced. I see a man who cannot control his temper." Tyrone's attorney, Preston Hale, rose quickly. "Your Honor, if I may, my client has been diagnosed with severe PTSD. The assault was a reflexive reaction during a night terror episode when a neighbor broke into his home unannounced. Tyrone didn't even realize he was no longer in a combat zone." "He served his country, Your Honor," Preston added. "He served his own interests, Mr. Hale," the judge interrupted, waving a dismissive hand. "We all have stress. I have a mortgage and a crushing caseload, yet I don't go around tackling my neighbors." A low murmur rippled through the gallery. Tyrone sat perfectly still, hands folded on the table. He could feel the familiar throb in his lower back, the place where shrapnel had missed his spine by a fraction of an inch, leaving him with permanent nerve damage and a prosthetic left leg that didn't always obey his brain. "Now," the judge continued, straightening his robe, "before I hand down my sentence, I want the defendant to address the court, and per the protocols of this chamber, the defendant will stand." Tyrone took a deep breath. His voice was a low, gravelly rumble. "Your Honor, with all due respect, I have a medical waiver in the file. Standing for prolonged periods causes significant nerve spasms in my remaining limb. It's quite painful today because of the humidity." The judge leaned forward, eyes narrowing behind gold-rimmed spectacles. "I read the file, Mr. Caldwell. I also see that you walked into this courtroom. If you can walk to your chair, you can stand to face the law. I find your disability to be a convenient shield for your lack of discipline. Stand up now." Preston Hale whispered frantically, "Just try, Tyrone. Don't give him a reason to hit you with the maximum." Tyrone's jaw tightened. He gripped the edge of the heavy table until his knuckles turned white. Slowly, agonizingly, he began to push himself up. The mechanical whine of the prosthetic joint filled the room, along with the audible grunt of pain escaping his teeth. As he reached his full height, his left leg began to tremble violently. He was standing, but vibrating with the sheer effort of it. "There," the judge sneered. "Not so hard, was it? Now tell me why I shouldn't put a violent veteran behind bars to protect the civilians of this city." Tyrone looked the judge straight in the eye. "I didn't fight for a background, Your Honor. I fought for the man next to me, and right now, I'm just trying to survive the peace." The judge opened his mouth to deliver a scathing retort. But then, something happened. Tyrone's leg gave way. A sharp crack echoed through the room as the locking mechanism on the prosthetic failed. Tyrone crashed forward, his chest hitting the table. As he scrambled to catch himself, a small worn leather pouch fell from his inner jacket pocket, spilling its contents onto the floor. A single silver dog tag slid across the polished wood and spun to a stop at the base of the judge's bench. Judge Beckett looked down at the tag, his expression one of annoyance. He signaled the bailiff to pick it up. But as the bailiff handed the metal scrap to the judge, Beckett's eyes landed on the name, Captain Elias Beckett. The judge's breath hitched. His hand began to shake. He looked at the tag, then at the sweating, pained soldier on the floor, then back at the tag. The date on the bottom marked the deadliest ambush in the Kunar province, the day Judge Harlan Beckett's only son had been reported killed in action. The room went deathly silent. The tough judge wasn't speaking. He was staring at Tyrone Caldwell as if he were seeing a ghost. The silence in the courtroom was no longer the silence of respect. It was the silence of a vacuum sucking the air out of everyone's lungs. Judge Beckett held the dog tag between his thumb and forefinger as if it were radioactive. His face, usually a mask of judicial indifference, had turned the color of parchment. "Where?" The judge's voice cracked, a sound no one in that building had ever heard before. He cleared his throat, trying to reclaim his authority, but his hand wouldn't stop trembling. "Where did you get this, Mr. Caldwell?" Tyrone was still on one knee, his prosthetic leg splayed at an awkward angle. The bailiff, a burly man named Officer Ramirez, no relation to the judge, reached down to help him up, but Tyrone waved him off. He wanted to stand on his own terms. He used the defense table to hoist himself up, his face slick with cold sweat. "That belonged to my CO," Tyrone said, his voice steady despite the pain radiating from his hip. "Captain Elias Beckett. He was the best officer I ever served under. He didn't just lead, he bled with us." The gallery gasped. Everyone in the county knew the judge had lost a son in the war, but Harlan Beckett had used that tragedy to build a political persona of uncompromising strength. He never spoke of the details. He simply wore the grief like armor to deflect any criticism of his harsh sentencing. "My son," the judge whispered, looking down at the tag. "This was lost. The army told us his personal effects were destroyed in the vehicle fire. How do you have this?" Tyrone took a shuddering breath. "Because it wasn't in the vehicle, Your Honor. It was in my hand. We were pinned down in a dry creek bed outside of Nangalam. The captain saw the RPG coming. He pushed me into a ditch. He took the blast. When I crawled over to him, he couldn't speak. He just gripped my hand and pressed that tag into my palm. He knew I'd make it out. He wanted someone to remember." The judge's eyes filled with sudden, sharp moisture. He looked at the man he had just called undisciplined and violent. He looked at the prosthetic leg he had mocked. "You were with him?" the judge asked, his voice barely audible. "I was the last person to touch him, sir," Tyrone said softly. "I've carried that tag every day for 12 years. I was going to send it to his family, but I didn't know how to tell them that the last thing he did was save a sergeant who was already half blown apart. I felt like I owed him my life, so I kept his memory close to keep me going." A sob broke out from the back of the courtroom. It was Tyrone's wife, Simone, who had been watching her husband be humiliated for the last hour. Judge Beckett looked at Tyrone, really looked at him, for the first time. He saw the silver star on the uniform. He realized that the assault Tyrone was being tried for, a reflex reaction to a perceived threat, was the direct result of the trauma sustained while saving the judge's own blood. The judge looked at the sentencing report on his desk. He had been planning to give Tyrone the maximum, 2 years in state prison. He looked at the dog tag again. Then, he looked at the court reporter. "Strike the last 5 minutes from the record," Judge Beckett commanded, his voice regaining some strength but carrying a new jagged edge. "Your Honor," the prosecutor, Grant Ellison, stood up, confused. "I said strike it," the judge barked. He stood up abruptly, his chair clattering against the wall behind him. "This court will take a 15-minute recess. Mr. Caldwell, remain where you are. Bailiff, bring the defendant to my chambers now." The gavel slammed down, but it didn't sound like judgment this time. It sounded like a plea. The judge's chambers were lined with leather-bound books and photos of him shaking hands with governors. But in the center of the desk was a framed photo of a young man in desert camo, Elias. Tyrone sat in a plush chair, his leg throbbing. Judge Beckett didn't sit behind his desk. He stood by the window, looking out at the city. "You lied to me," the judge said, his back turned. "I didn't lie, Your Honor. I just didn't think my service record was relevant to whether or not I pushed my neighbor," Tyrone replied. The judge turned around, his eyes red. "Not about that. You said Elias saved you. You said he pushed you into a ditch." "He did." "No," the judge said, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "I've read the classified after-action reports. I used my clearance as a former federal prosecutor to see them. The report says Captain Beckett was found 30 yards away from the blast site. It says he was trying to retreat." Tyrone went still. The air in the room changed. "The report was written by Major Gregory Drummond," Tyrone said, his voice turning cold. "Drummond wasn't even in the creek bed. He was 2 miles away in a command center." "Drummond is a senator now," the judge said, stepping closer. "He told me my son died a hero. But the unofficial word was that Elias panicked, that his retreat caused the deaths of 3 other men. I've lived with that shame for a decade. I've been hard on veterans in this court because I blame my son's weakness for what happened over there." Tyrone stood up, ignoring the scream of pain from his leg. He looked the judge dead in the eyes. "Your son didn't panic, and he didn't retreat. Major Drummond told you that, because Drummond was the one who ordered the airstrike on the wrong coordinates. He used your son as a scapegoat to protect his political career. Elias didn't die retreating. He died running into the blast zone to pull me out because I was pinned under a fallen wall. He saved me, and he saved the 3 men Drummond says he caused to die. I have the helmet cam footage, Judge. I've had it for 12 years. The judge froze. "Footage? Why didn't you come forward?" "Because Drummond threatened to dishonorably discharge the entire squad if we spoke up. He told us he'd make sure our families never saw a dime of our pensions. I had a daughter with a heart defect, Judge. I couldn't risk her surgery, so I buried it. I buried the truth, and I carried your son's tag as a penance." The judge's face went from pale to a deep, boiling purple. The man who had spent years being the hanging judge, punishing others for their lapses in character, realized he had been played by a corrupt politician and that he had been punishing the very man who held the evidence of his son's true heroism. "Where is it?" the judge hissed. "The footage." "It's in a safe deposit box at First National," Tyrone said. "But Judge, if you use it, you're not just going after a senator. You're admitting that every tough sentence you've handed out to veterans was based on a lie you told yourself." The judge looked at the photo of his son. Then he looked at Tyrone. "I don't care about my career anymore, Sergeant," he said, and for the first time, he sounded like a father instead of a judge. "I want my son's name back." The 15-minute recess had stretched into 40. The courtroom was buzzing with nervous electric energy. Reporters from the Atlanta Journal-Constitution were frantically texting their editors, and the air in the gallery was thick with speculation. When the side door finally creaked open, the bailiff didn't shout, "All rise," with his usual boredom. He sounded shaken. Judge Harlan Beckett walked to his bench, but he didn't look like the man who had walked off it. His shoulders, usually pulled back in rigid superiority, were slumped. His face was a mask of grief and cold, simmering fury. He didn't sit down. He stood behind the bench, his hands gripping the wood so hard his knuckles were bone white. "Mr. Caldwell," the judge said, his voice echoing in the rafters, "please remain seated. Officer, get this man a chair with proper lumbar support and a footrest, now." The courtroom gasped. The prosecutor, Grant Ellison, stood up, his mouth agape. "Your Honor, the sentencing," the prosecutor began. "The sentencing is stayed," the judge snapped, his eyes flashing with predatory light. "And Mr. Ellison, I suggest you take a seat before I find you in contempt for breathing too loudly. We are waiting for a guest." At that moment, the heavy double doors at the back of the courtroom swung open. In walked a man who radiated power, Senator Victor Langford. He was dressed in a $3,000 suit, his silver hair perfectly coiffed. He was followed by 2 aides and a security detail. Langford had been the commanding general of the division Tyrone had served in before retiring to serve the people in Washington. Langford walked down the center aisle with a practiced political smile. "Harlan, I heard there was some confusion regarding my late godson's effects. I came as soon as I got your message. I thought we settled these matters years ago." Judge Beckett looked at Langford, and for a moment, the two powerful men locked eyes, one who had built a career on a lie, the other who had just realized his entire life's bitterness was a gift from that liar. "Victor," the judge said, his voice dropping to a dangerous register, "Sergeant Caldwell here was just telling me about a certain dry creek bed in Nangalam. He mentioned an airstrike, one that went off target." Senator Langford's smile didn't falter, but his eyes turned to chips of ice. He looked over at Tyrone, who was sitting in the newly provided chair, his prosthetic leg resting on a stool. "Sergeant Caldwell," the senator said, his voice smooth as silk, "I remember you. A brave soldier. But sometimes, trauma plays tricks on the memory. We discussed this during the debriefing. You were concussed. You were confused." "I wasn't confused about the drone feed, Senator," Tyrone said, his voice low and steady. "I wasn't confused about the coordinates you keyed in while you were trying to impress the visiting dignitaries at the TOC. And I certainly wasn't confused when Captain Beckett died because you were too proud to call abort on a target you couldn't identify. The gallery was so quiet you could hear the hum of the air conditioning. This was no longer an assault trial. It was a military tribunal unfolding in a civilian court. "Your Honor," the senator said, turning back to the bench, his tone now patronizing, "this man is clearly suffering from a mental break. His PTSD has manifested as a delusional vendetta. I have the official reports signed by 5 officers that state my godson died due to his own tactical error. To suggest otherwise is a slur against the dead." Judge Beckett leaned over his bench, his face inches from the senator's. "The dead can't speak, Victor, but apparently they can leave behind digital footprints." The judge held up a small silver USB drive that Tyrone had handed him in chambers, the drive Tyrone had kept hidden in the lining of his prosthetic for a decade as his insurance policy. "Sergeant Caldwell has provided this court with the raw, unedited helmet cam footage from the day my son died," the judge lied. Tyrone hadn't handed it over yet, but the bluff was a masterstroke. "And I've just finished viewing the first 3 minutes in my chambers. Do you know what I saw, Victor? I saw my son saving his men, and I heard your voice on the comms, screaming at him to stay put while the steel rain came down on his own position." Senator Langford's face finally cracked. The tan seemed to melt from his skin, leaving him gray and haggard. "Harlan, let's be reasonable. Think of the implications. Think of your career. Think of the party." "I am thinking of my son," the judge whispered. "And I am thinking of this soldier whom I treated like a criminal because I believed your poison." Judge Beckett looked at the bailiff. "Officer, lock the doors. No one leaves, especially not the senator." The hard karma was no longer a looming shadow. It was a freight train. Senator Langford tried to turn toward the exit, but the bailiff, a veteran himself who had been listening with growing rage, placed a heavy hand on the senator's shoulder. "The judge said stay put, Senator," the bailiff growled. Judge Beckett turned his attention back to the prosecutor. "Mr. Ellison," he said, his voice trembling with barely contained fury, "in light of this new evidence regarding the defendant's state of mind and the certain miscarriage of justice regarding his military record, the state moves to dismiss all charges against Tyrone Caldwell with prejudice." "Denied," the judge barked. The room froze. Tyrone looked up, confused. Was the judge turning on him again? "I won't just dismiss the charges," Judge Beckett said, his eyes burning with righteous fire. "We are going to finish the sentencing, but we aren't sentencing Tyrone Caldwell. We are sentencing the system that broke him and the man who lied to cover it up." He looked at Langford. "Victor, you're not a defendant here yet, but I am a judge of the Superior Court, and I am officially opening an evidentiary hearing into obstruction of justice and the falsification of military records. Sergeant Caldwell, I want you to tell this court and the cameras exactly what happened when the sky fell." Tyrone stood up. This time, he didn't need the table. The pain was still there, a dull roar in his hip, but the weight of the secret he had carried for 12 years was gone. He felt light. He felt tall. "We were in the creek bed," Tyrone began, his voice filling the room, resonant and powerful. Captain Beckett knew the coordinates were wrong. He called it in 3 times. He was told to shut up and color. When he saw the birds coming in for the run, he didn't run away. He ran toward the youngest private in our squad, a kid named Benny Harlan, who was stuck in the mud. He threw Benny into a culvert and shielded him with his own body. He wasn't a failure. He was the bravest man I ever knew. As Tyrone spoke, the gallery began to weep. Even the hard-boiled reporters were wiping their eyes. "And while he was dying," Tyrone continued, looking directly at the senator, "he told me to keep his tag. He said, 'My father needs to know I did my duty.' He didn't know his father would be lied to. He didn't know his father would become a man who hated veterans because he thought his son was a coward." Judge Beckett put his head in his hands. The sound of a powerful man sobbing is something that stays with you forever. It was a raw, gut-wrenching sound, the sound of a decade of misplaced anger and grief being torn out by the roots. Senator Langford saw his opening. He tried to push past the bailiff. "This is a circus. I am a United States senator. You have no jurisdiction." "I have jurisdiction over the truth," the judge screamed, slamming his gavel so hard the wooden handle snapped. "And the truth is going to bury you." Suddenly, the doors burst open. It wasn't more of Langford's goons. It was the FBI. Tyrone hadn't just given the footage to the judge. Before the trial, he had sent a digital copy to a contact at the bureau, an old Army buddy who had been waiting for the signal. Special Agent Marcus Reed stepped forward, holding a warrant. "Senator Langford, you are under arrest for witness tampering, obstruction of justice, and violations of the Stolen Valor Act regarding your claims about the Nangalam engagement. Please, put your hands behind your back." The karma didn't just hit, it obliterated. As Langford was led out in handcuffs, the gallery erupted into a standing ovation. But the real drama was just beginning, because the judge wasn't finished. The heavy brass-fitted doors of the courtroom didn't just close behind the FBI and the disgraced senator. They seemed to seal off the rest of the world. For a long, agonizing minute, the only sound in the room was the rhythmic mechanical hum of the air conditioning and the soft clicking of the court reporter's keys as she caught up with the most explosive transcript in the history of the county courthouse. Judge Harlan Beckett didn't return to his high-backed mahogany chair. He stood behind the bench, his hands resting on the polished wood, looking down at the small silver dog tag that lay there like a fallen soldier. The light from the high windows caught the metal, reflecting a tiny glint of silver into his eyes that were no longer sharp and judgmental, but hollowed out by a decade's worth of misplaced grief. The gallery sat in suspended animation. No one whispered. No one moved. They were watching a man's entire identity, the hanging judge, the guardian of discipline, disintegrate in real time. Harlan looked up, his gaze finding Tyrone Caldwell. Tyrone was still standing. His face was beaded with sweat, his jaw set against the throbbing pain in his hip, but he looked more like a giant than a defendant. He looked like the only steady thing in a room that had just been hit by a hurricane. Sergeant Caldwell, the judge began. His voice was no longer the thunderous baritone that usually made lawyers tremble. It was a dry, thin rasp. Please sit down. In fact, bailiff, get a chair from my chambers, the leather one. Bring it here, right now. The bailiff, a man who had seen Judge Beckett sentence men to life without a blink, moved with frantic urgency. Within seconds, a plush, oversized chair was placed behind Tyrone. Sit, Tyrone, the judge said, his voice cracking on the name. Please. Tyrone lowered himself into the chair, the prosthetic joint letting out a soft metallic sigh as it finally took the weight off his stump. He looked at the judge, and for the first time, he didn't see an adversary. He saw a man who had been a prisoner of a lie for 12 years, a man who had just been handed the keys to a cell he didn't even know he was in. Judge Beckett walked down from the bench. This was a violation of every protocol in the book. A judge does not leave the bench during an active proceeding to stand on the floor with a defendant. But Harlan wasn't acting as a judge anymore. He was a father who had just realized he had spent 10 years spitting on the memory of his own son by punishing the men who were most like him. He walked across the worn carpet, his black robe billowing like a shroud. He stopped 3 feet from Tyrone. The court reporter's fingers flew across the keys, documenting a moment that would eventually be studied in every law school in the country. I have sat on that bench for 15 years, Harlan said, his voice gaining a jagged emotional edge. I have prided myself on my uncompromising nature. I told myself that the law was a machine and that my job was to make sure it ran without emotion. I saw veterans come into this room, men who had seen things I could never imagine, and I judged them for their weakness. I judged them because I thought my son was a coward. I thought Elias had run away. And because he wasn't here for me to scream at, I screamed at every one of you. He looked at the gallery, at the rows of people who had seen him hand down maximum sentences to men with PTSD, men with addiction, men with broken bodies. I used my son's shame as a whetstone to sharpen my gavel, Harlan whispered, turning back to Tyrone. I thought I was honoring a standard he failed, but all I was doing was helping a monster like Langford hide the fact that he murdered my boy. And you knew. You carried that medal for 12 years. And you let me treat you like a criminal today, all to make sure that when the truth came out, it came out where it mattered. Tyrone looked at the judge, his dark eyes filled with a weary, grounded wisdom. I didn't do it to spite you, Judge. I did it because Elias deserved better. He was the best of us. He didn't just lead the squad. He carried the squad. When that airstrike was called in, he didn't flinch. He knew what was coming. He could have stayed in the culvert. He could have saved himself. But he saw me pinned, and he saw Private Terrence Kane, a 19-year-old kid from Ohio, shaking in the mud. He went for us. He died so I could sit here today and be insulted by you. I figured I could handle a few minutes of standing if he could handle a rain of steel. A sob broke out from the back of the room. It was Tyrone's wife, Simone, her face buried in her hands. The sound seemed to break the last of the judge's composure. Harlan Beckett bowed his head. His shoulders shook. He reached out and gripped the edge of the table Tyrone was sitting at. I have no right to ask for your forgiveness, Sergeant, he said. I have spent years being a part of the system that broke you further after you were already shattered. I was the hard karma for so many men. But today, the karma belongs to me. He wiped his eyes with the back of his hand and looked at the prosecutor. Mr. Ellison, The state's motion to dismiss? Grant Ellison swallowed hard. Your Honor, the state moves to dismiss all charges against Tyrone Caldwell with extreme prejudice. Furthermore, the state will be filing a motion to expunge his entire record, and we will be coordinating with the Department of Justice to ensure Mr. Caldwell receives full restitution for the harassment he has suffered under the previous administration's influence. The motion to dismiss is granted, Harlan said, but we aren't done. Record this, Miss Clark. This is the final sentence of this court regarding the matter of the people versus Tyrone Caldwell. The judge stood tall, his eyes burning with a new, terrifyingly focused purpose. The defendant is not only free, Harlan declared. The defendant is vindicated. But as a judge of this state, I find that the true crime here was a failure of the bench. As my final act from this position, I am ordering an immediate judicial audit of every veteran sentencing I have presided over in the last decade. I will personally review every case, every mitigating factor I ignored, and I will be filing petitions for clemency for every man and woman I failed. He turned back to Tyrone. And for you, Tyrone, you told me your neighbor was the one who broke into your house. The man you assaulted was a developer trying to scare you off your land, wasn't he? Tyrone nodded slowly. He wanted the lot for a condo project. He knew I had the night terrors. He figured if he tripped the alarm and broke the window, I'd react, and the crazy veteran narrative would do the rest of his work for him. His name is Brock Kensington, Your Honor, Simone added from the gallery, her voice clear and sharp. Bailiff, the judge barked, contact the district attorney's office. I want a warrant for Brock Kensington for criminal trespass, attempted fraud, and malicious provocation. And I want his assets frozen. We're going to find out exactly how much he was paying Senator Langford to keep the police from looking too closely at his development tactics. The hard karma was no longer an abstract concept. It was a wrecking ball. The gallery began to murmur, the realization of the scale of the corruption sinking in. This wasn't just a veteran being cleared. It was the dismantling of a localized empire of greed. But Judge Beckett wasn't finished. He reached into the inner pocket of his robe and pulled out a fountain pen, a gold-nibbed instrument he had used to sign the most important documents of his life. He placed it on the table in front of Tyrone. I have a retirement fund, Sergeant, Harlan said, his voice dropping to a low, private register. It's substantial. I was going to use it to travel, to hide away from a world I thought had stolen my son. But I don't think I'll be traveling much anymore. I'm resigning my seat today. I can't sit in judgment of others when I didn't even know my own heart. You don't have to do that, sir, Tyrone said softly. I do, Harlan insisted. But before I go, I want to give you something. Not just the truth, but a future. I am establishing a trust in Elias's name, a legal defense fund for veterans in this state who are being squeezed by developers, by corrupt politicians, and by a system that forgets them the moment they take off the uniform. And I want you to run it, Tyrone. I want you to be the one who tells me which cases we take. I'll provide the law, and you provide the soul. Tyrone looked at the pen, then at the judge. He saw a man who had been stripped of his pride, his position, and his illusions. And in their place, he found a desperate need to make things right. I'm just a sergeant, Judge, Tyrone said, a faint wry smile touching his lips. I don't know much about trust funds. You knew enough to keep a dog tag for 12 years to save a man's honor, Harlan replied. That's more than most lawyers learn in a lifetime. Will you do it? Will you help me fix what I broke? Tyrone looked at Simone. She nodded, her face wet with tears of relief. He looked back at the judge. Slowly, he reached out and took the pen. I guess I've got nothing but time, sir, Tyrone said. And my leg could use a break from the construction sites anyway. The room erupted. It wasn't the polite applause of a courtroom. It was a roar of catharsis. The reporters were frantically calling their desks, shouting over the noise about the fall of the hanging judge and the ascension of the hidden hero. Harlan Beckett didn't look at the cameras. He didn't look at his bailiff. He reached down and picked up his son's dog tag. He held it to his lips for a brief second, then pressed it into Tyrone's palm. "Keep it a little longer, Tyrone," Harlan whispered, "until we get the first office opened. I want it to be the first thing we hang on the wall, a reminder that the law serves the truth, not the other way around." As Judge Harlan Beckett turned to walk out of his own courtroom for the last time, he didn't look like a man who had lost his career. He looked like a man who had finally found his son. And as Tyrone Caldwell stood up, steadily, proudly, and without the judge's order, he knew that the war was finally, truly over. The heavy oak doors of the courtroom didn't just close behind Senator Victor Langford. They seemed to seal a tomb on a decade of deception. The silence that followed was heavy, not with the tension of a trial, but with the profound gravity of a world shifting on its axis. Judge Harlan Beckett remained standing at the base of his bench, only inches away from Tyrone Caldwell. The distance between the hanging judge and the defendant had vanished, replaced by a raw human connection forged in the fires of shared grief and the sudden, blinding light of the truth. Harlan looked down at his hands, the same hands that had signed countless warrants and sentencing orders, and saw them shaking. He wasn't just a judge anymore. He was a father who had just been handed back his son's honor. "Sergeant," Harlan whispered, his voice cracking through the quiet room, "I spent 10 years hating the man I thought my son had become. I turned that hate into a gavel, and I hit everyone I could reach with it. I thought I was being tough. I thought I was honoring a standard he failed to meet. But all I was doing was helping the man who killed him hide the body." Tyrone reached out, his calloused hand steadying the judge's arm. "You weren't the only one he lied to, sir. Langford didn't just use a pen. He used the entire weight of the United States government to crush anyone who knew the truth. He told me I was a hero in one breath and told me he'd ruin my family in the next if I ever shared that footage. For 12 years, I felt like I was back in that creek bed every single night. But today, for the first time, I think I finally climbed out of it." While the courtroom was a vacuum of emotion, the world outside was already exploding. Reporter Jolene Whitaker, a veteran investigative journalist for the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, had been sitting in the third row. She hadn't just taken notes, she had been live tweeting the entire proceeding. By the time the FBI reached the courthouse steps with Langford, the video of Tyrone standing up, defying the judge's orders only to reveal the dog tag, had been viewed over 6 million times. The hard karma didn't just hit Langford. It hit the entire political machine he had built. Within the hour, Attorney General Jackson Reed held a televised press conference. The evidence Tyrone had provided, the raw helmet cam footage, and the encrypted comms logs he had saved on that silver drive, was undeniable. It showed not only the tactical error of the airstrike, but the frantic, panicked voice of then General Langford as he realized he had bombed his own men and immediately began coordinating a cover-up. By sunset, every billboard in Atlanta that bore Langford's face was being defaced. The Langford Law Library at the State University saw students gathering to demand a name change. The senator's wife released a statement through her attorneys announcing she was filing for divorce and freezing their joint assets. The man who had lived for his image saw that image shattered into a million jagged pieces, and he was forced to watch it happen from a cold holding cell in the federal detention center. Back in the courtroom, Judge Beckett knew his career on the bench was over, but he had one last series of orders to sign. He didn't wait for a new trial. He invoked extraordinary judicial oversight. "Mr. Ellison," the judge said, looking at the prosecutor who was still hovering near the defense table, "I want a list. Every veteran who has passed through this courtroom in the last 10 years, everyone I gave a maximum sentence to, everyone I dismissed as undisciplined. You and I are going to work through the night. We are going to review every single case. If there is even a hint that their service-connected trauma was ignored or used against them, we are filing for immediate sentence commutations. We started this fire, Mr. Ellison. We're going to be the ones to put it out." Grant Ellison nodded solemnly. "I'll get the files from the clerk's office right now, sir." Tyrone watched them work. He felt a hand on his shoulder and turned to see his wife, Simone. She was crying, but her eyes were bright with a pride he hadn't seen in years. "You did it, Tyrone," she whispered. "You finally brought him home." "No," Tyrone said, looking at the dog tag Harlan was still clutching. "We brought both of them home." The following months were a whirlwind of hard karma and harder healing. As Senator Langford's legal team tried to argue that the footage was tampered with, the FBI uncovered a ledger in the senator's private safe. It contained the names of 3 other officers who had been bribed or coerced into signing the false after-action reports. One by one, those men fell. One, a retired colonel, broke down in a tearful confession on 60 Minutes, detailing how Langford had threatened to cut off his daughter's medical benefits if he didn't help bury the Nangalam incident. While the villains were being stripped of their rank and their dignity, Tyrone Caldwell was finally getting the care he had been denied. Under the care of Dr. Samuel Bennett at the Shepherd Center, Tyrone underwent a cutting-edge osseointegration surgery, a procedure that would permanently fuse a titanium bolt to his femur, allowing his prosthetic to be directly attached to his bone. No more clicking, no more shifting, and no more pain from a socket that didn't fit. The surgery was expensive, upwards of $200,000. But the bill never reached Tyrone. It was paid in full by an anonymous donor, though everyone knew it was Judge Harlan Beckett, who had sold his suburban mansion and moved into a small apartment to liquidate his assets for the cause. 6 months after the trial, the sentencing of Senator Victor Langford took place. This time, Harlan Beckett wasn't the judge. He was a witness. He sat in the gallery next to Tyrone and Simone. The new judge, a woman known for her ironclad adherence to the truth, looked down at the former senator. Langford looked haggard. His suit was cheap, his hair was thinning, and the arrogance that had once defined him had been replaced by a bitter, hollow stare. "Mr. Langford," the judge began, "you didn't just kill 3 men with your negligence, you killed the truth. You spent a decade poisoning the relationship between a father and his son. You used the power of the United States to gaslight a hero like Tyrone Caldwell. There is no sentence long enough to repair the damage you've done, but we will start with the maximum." As Langford was led away to serve 25 years in Leavenworth, he had to walk past the front row. He stopped for a second, looking at Tyrone. "You think you won?" Langford hissed, a final spark of venom in his eyes. "You're still a—" Tyrone didn't flinch. He stood up perfectly balanced on his new limb, tall and unshakable. "I'm not whatever you were about to call me, Victor," Tyrone said, his voice echoing with a peace Langford would never know. "I'm a witness, and Harlan isn't a nobody. He's the father of a hero. You're just a ghost who hasn't realized he's already dead." The story concludes, not in a courtroom, but at the opening of the Captain Elias Beckett Veteran Advocacy Center. The building, a repurposed colonial estate in the heart of Atlanta, was a beacon of hope. It housed the Caldwell and Beckett Legal Clinic, where pro bono lawyers fought for veterans' benefits, and the Nangalam Wellness Wing, which specialized in PTSD treatment. On the day of the ribbon cutting, a crowd of hundreds gathered. Among them was Benny Harlan, the private Elias Beckett had saved in the culvert. Benny had been living on the streets of Seattle, lost in a haze of guilt and addiction, until he saw the video of Tyrone in the courtroom. That video had been his lifeline. He had flown to Atlanta, checked into rehab at the center, and was now 3 months sober. Judge Harlan Beckett stood at the podium. He looked at Tyrone, who was standing to his left, and then at the bronze plaque near the door. The plaque featured a relief of the dog tag Tyrone had carried for 12 years. For a long time, Harlan told the crowd, "I thought the law was about punishment. I thought it was about holding people to a standard they couldn't possibly meet. But Tyrone Caldwell taught me that the law is nothing without mercy. And mercy is impossible without the truth. My son didn't die for a flag or a politician. He died for his brother. And today, we make sure no brother or sister is ever left behind again. As the ribbon was cut, Tyrone looked up at the clear Georgia sky. He felt a strange lightness in his chest, a feeling he hadn't had since before the war. The mission wasn't just over, it had been redeemed. He reached into his pocket and touched a small silver coin Harlan had given him. On one side was the seal of the Silver Star. On the other, a simple inscription, "Stand tall." And Tyrone Caldwell did, not because a judge ordered him to, but because he finally had a reason to. This story is a powerful reminder that the truth has a way of surfacing, no matter how deep it's buried under lies and power. Tyrone Caldwell faced the ultimate test of character, standing up to a judge who demanded respect while offering none. But by holding on to his integrity and the memory of a fallen brother, he didn't just win his freedom. He brought a corrupt empire to its knees and helped a grieving father find his way back to the light. If this story touched your heart or made you believe in the power of justice, please hit that like button. It helps us share these stories of heroism and karma with more people who need to hear them. Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you never miss another deep dive into the real-life dramas that change our world. And finally, share this video with someone who needs to be reminded that no matter how hard you're pushed down, you have the strength to stand back up. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.